Have you ever seen a horse clip-clopping down the street and thought, why do horses wear shoes? And how did we end up forging iron U-shapes and nailing those right onto their feet? Horse protection has a history that spans continents and centuries, starting with ancient Asia, making its way to Europe, and eventually spreading throughout the world. From Japan's straw horse sandals to the Roman hipposandal, humans have been obsessively trying to protect horse feet in the name of traction and protection for centuries. But when did we start nailing shoes on? And why is it so hard to trace that timeline? Join us as we explore the mysterious history of the horseshoe. Welcome to History from Horseback. All right, I guess we should get started.
Yeah. I feel like today will be a short episode though, and that's not such a bad thing. We've had two really long ones.
Yeah. I kind of wanted this one to be kind of like on the shorter side, kind of like lighter. I don't know.
Yeah. Also, this is going to have me yapping about AC Shadows, and honestly, it wouldn't be one of our episodes if I didn't yap about some sort of video game. So
I figured.
I'd be like, I feel like this episode came about because I was like, oh my god, look at the shoes.
It maybe had something to do with that. Well, because then I was like, well, to be honest, I got that idea because when I saw you showing me the shoes, and I was like, oh, I bet there's like all sorts of different like ancient horseshoes for like different cultures and stuff, and I can talk about that. And then I like look into it and I'm like, actually no, for the most part everybody was just like had the same idea, and there's only so many times you can make a different covering for a horse hoof. So this is actually much shorter than I thought it would be. And also I thought that we'd have like a recorded history really on like the horseshoe. Turns out it's kind of a big mystery, which we'll get to, but like no one really knows where like nail-on horseshoes come from.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to get to that point. I love drama. Let's go.
Oh yeah. I love when the history nerds start to fight. It's great. So to start our episode off about horseshoes and hoof protection, first we need to kind of address the question of why do horses need horseshoes or hoof protection in the first place? So pretty much as far back as like horse domestication goes, or at least riding horses or using them as beasts of burden, so work animals to pull things. Ever since then, it seems like humans have kind of tried to come up with some sort of idea to at least slightly protect horse hooves.
Which makes sense because, I can only assume that horses were not much different from this day and age where there are always things going wrong. Some are worse than others. Some have better feet than others. And, some are going to need a bit more attention than others. One horse who may excel in, rocky terrains or whatever, it could be totally different to another that just suffers completely and needs the support.
Yeah, absolutely. Though I do imagine that like horses back then especially probably couldn't get away with having as many like hoof problems as they get away with now, if that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
if a horse had bad feet, they just wouldn't reproduce. Like they wouldn't live long enough for anyone to allow them to breed.
They just didn't breed them. What a shocking thought. What a shocking thought that if a horse has a major conformational flaw that we probably shouldn't breed it. That's a crazy thought.
Yeah. Like, I mean, like, thinking back to like the Scythians and how they were nomadic, right? So they're constantly traveling. So you couldn't even necessarily be like, oh, this horse is lame, we're going to have her be a broodmare, because she still needs to be able to keep up with the rest of the herd and like make it from point A to point B when you all need to move to new grass. And new pastures. So like And then also, even back then, they had some sort of concept of, well, we don't want that trait to continue on. And they were
Yeah,
starting to grasp the basics of just that, like, if you pair together two animals that have, like, a certain trait, then their baby is more likely to also have that trait.
yeah. No, like, no one has an understanding of genes at this point, but it's not hard to sort of see that, or to figure out that when we put two and two together, something comes out, you know, not in the middle, but it comes out either looking like one or the other, or a little bit of both in some instances. But it's really funny as well because you think about, Arabians who were bred to have broader feet for walking on sand because they of the thing that they of the uh, climate that they lived in, and Turkmens were exactly the same because they had narrower feet than the Arabians because they were more on rocky terrain and through mountainous regions and whatnot. So they were thinking about it. They knew what they were doing.
Yeah. And it's like whether I mean, they didn't really, like you said before, understand that it was genes doing it. No one had an idea of like really what evolution was or that sort of thing, but they did know a little bit about like breeding,
Yeah.
They, and this is like, I mean, this is in the writings of like Xenophon, of discussing a little bit about like wanting to breed animals that are the, best of the best, like you rather than just breeding something that doesn't have desirable traits. Yeah, like backtracking a little bit, I actually think maybe a little bit of a lesson on like just the basic anatomy of like a horse hoof and what it actually is will help with understanding how horseshoes function, and the purpose that they play. So we talked a little bit about this in like the very first episode when I talked about the origin of the modern horse, because we talked a little bit about how their toes fused over time, over like millions of years. So if you aren't aware, a horse is they have their hoof is basically a toe.
A big toenail.
Yeah, it's basically a big toenail, and they're basically balancing on a toe, which is like kind of the result of the fusion of multiple toes. So, for us, if we look at our own foot, we have like five, toes, right? If all of those just like fused into one, which is terrifying to think of,
Yeah, absolutely mortifying to think that eventually you needed to run so fast that all your toes fused into one and
Yeah.
just became this. Oh, yeah, mortifying.
Yeah. But so what it might be kind of hard to visualize, but like if we think about our fingers, right? How we have like the three segmented bones in each of our fingers. So imagine all of those like fusing together like next to each other, but there's still kind of the different segments. And so that
Yeah,
very tip one.
I was just gonna say, I actually really don't want to think about that at all. I don't want to think
Oh,
about my
sorry.
fingers fusing. No, no, thank you. I could go without doing that.
I'm just trying to establish like so there are bones inside of there's a bone
I
inside
don't
of a
want to
hoof.
think of the amorphous blob that my hand is about to be. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. Um, but yeah.
It's nightmare fuel, man.
But yeah, basically what I'm trying to get at is that it's like there is a bone inside of a horse's hoof, but it's kind of buried deeper inside of there and covered by different tissues. So it's covered partially by what we call like the digital cushion, which is a fancy way of basically saying like that kind of soft part at the heel of their hoof. That part is kind of softer, squishier. It has some like kind of more fatty, like connective tissue going on over there. It is like literally like a cushion for their weight to fall on. Horses will have something called the frog, which is a kind of, I always thought was kind of a funny name. if you were to like pick up a horse's hoof and look at the underside of it, it's a V shape on the bottom of their hoof. And the frog is more kind of connective tissue. And so something that's kind of cool is that because the frog is a little bit squishy, the the action of the weight of a horse's of a horse's weight like loading onto their hoof. So when they're stepping down onto the ground and they're putting their weight on their hoof, that kind of squishes the frog, and that action actually helps pump blood through their leg. So it's like they have little pumps on the undersides of their feet. And that's like why movement is really healthy and important for horses, because it actually improves their blood flow throughout their entire legs. And part of that is because they're so freaking big that their hearts need all the help they can get to push blood through their bodies. We also have the wall of the hoof, which is kind of the thing that we all see. That's the part of the hoof that is like kind of, either a grayish color, it can be white in some horses.
Some wild photos of really bad laminitic cases where the hoof wall just pulls away from the entire hoof, which is super graphic. Don't look that up if you're not good with like gore, but it does give you a really great like look at just how the hoof is put together.
Because like basically that hoof wall it's made out of, I believe, the same material as our fingernails are, because it basically is a fingernail. And that's like basically protecting everything that's inside of the hoof itself. And it's constantly growing. And so that's why horses get their hooves trimmed, because just like our fingernails, they're constantly growing. So the wall is attached to the coffin bone, to the bone inside, by this layer of tissue called the lamina. And that's kind of what Keely was talking about when she was referring to laminitis. So inflammation of the lamina it basically is where that tissue gets inflamed, and in severe cases it starts to actually separate from the coffin bone, and it's painful. I mean, like, I keep talking about like really disturbing comparisons, but it is like, imagine how painful to get toenails ripped off. Like it's the same thing happening.
It's got to be just miserable. Like, I mean, like at that point you're euthanizing. Like there's nothing you can do to put a hoof back together once that's happening. Ideally, like, you're never ever getting to that stage. It would be in like very, very critical cases.
Right.
But yeah, wow, it is I remember the first time I ever saw it, like a picture of it happening. It was mind-blowing that like that's how far it can go. Because I think a lot of people talk about laminitis as just like this little thing that their old horses get, and that it's not.
Yeah, and it's like what they're talking about are like flare-ups of some inflammation. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's still painful and not good, and you want to deal with it.
Yeah.
But it's not, that. It's not the severe case of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God, Julia, please.
I know that.
Why? She wants to play. The last part of the hoof that I just want to talk about real fast is the sole. And this is what makes up most of the bottom of the hoof. And it's more of that nail, like fingernail type material. And that also, grows over time and thickens and then wears away. Like it normally naturally abrades away out in nature, in the wild. And just like how, they don't need hoof trimmings because they're walking all over rocky terrain and their hooves kind of naturally trim, but they don't do it nice and evenly and, all nicely. Like, like we do for our horses, they kind of chip away. So, I mean, their hooves kind of take care of themselves, yes, but they're not gonna look all pretty, and there is a higher chance of the hoof wall like splitting a little bit in some places or chipping or that sort of thing. And so that's where horseshoes come in. For the hoof wall, it can chip away, especially with hard rocks and that sort of things. And then also that sole area, while it can become thick, some horses, they end up with what we call like thin soles. So that's just where that there's not much of that like keratin in the way. And so when they step on things like gravelly pebbles and stuff that kind of stick into their foot, it's uncomfortable. It's just like if you and I were walking on gravel in bare feet, like it's not gonna kill us. We'll be okay.
Like the more calluses you've built up on your feet, the more comfortable it is, or like the less uncomfortable it is. But
yeah,
it doesn't
exactly.
make it great.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, but we can, you can, and if you step in something that like is really sharp, you can, end up getting like bruising or even like puncture wounds or that sort of thing on your feet. So that can still happen to horses.
And that's why it's so important to pick horses' feet out. Because if
Yes.
something's compacted in there and then something else gets compacted on top of that, you're just shoving whatever is on the bottom layer further and further into the tissue. And it's just going to get worse and worse and worse until it's embedded properly. And then it starts to grow over and, et cetera, et cetera. And it just turns into a nightmare.
Yeah.
For all those
Yeah.
people who have watched the very cozy hoof GP videos and all the other,
Yeah.
things like that, they'll know.
Yeah. My first horse instructor always told me that it's not the big rocks that you gotta worry about especially when you're like picking out a horse's hoof, or like it's usually not the big rocks that cause like lameness or discomfort in the horse. It's usually just like the tiniest little ones, but they get like lodged between like the hoof wall and the sole, maybe, in that little, and they call that the white line.
And it's equivalent to like getting a rock in your shoe. Like it's going to bother the shit out of you, and it's going to be really annoying and painful until you're a human. You have the ability to take your shoe off and get the rock out. Whereas a nail-on shoe, or a horse with a longer toe, or like it's a bit overgrown and it's just holding it in somehow, or like it's severely impacted or whatever the hell. Like they don't really have thumbs, can't really pry it out themselves. Like
Yeah, exactly. And so all of this to say that pretty soon after they started working horses, so after they started having them like pulling things, or when they started riding on their backs, which meant that they were, the horses were working a lot. They were exerting themselves, and they were traveling a lot more, and possibly traveling in places where humans wanted them to go, but maybe where a wild horse would choose not to go. Because a wild horse can go, that kind of hurts on my feet. I'm going to go over here. A domesticated horse can't really do that. They don't get to choose where they go, especially back then when it's like, we have to march this way for war.
Yeah, exactly.
And so they needed to start finding ways to protect hooves. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you may have realized that I enjoy trail riding. Well, out here in Texas, the trails can get rocky and hard. Just like humans, horses need protection on their feet to avoid chipping and bruising. Some horses, like my horse Ace, don't need to wear metal shoes 24/7, but could use protection out on the trail or in other circumstances. This is where Scoot Boot comes in. Scoot Boot hoof boots offer comfort and protection for your equine's feet. Their hoof boot technology includes unique tread patterns that provide traction and support, built-in drainage for water, mud, and sand, and a flexible, shock-absorbing sole. Our listeners can receive a 10% discount on any purchase of Scoot Boot products. Just follow the link included in the episode's description and use promo code HISTORYFROMHORSEBACK on checkout. That's History from Horseback with no spaces at scootboots.com. But looking back in time, it seems that the earliest of hoof coverings likely originated in Asia, which,
Makes
doesn't
sense.
surprise me.
Yeah, most things originated in Asia.
Right? Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the earliest stirrups were found in Asia as well.
Yeah, I think so.
Like way, way back.
Yeah. And also like we don't just mean like East Asia because I feel like, at least for me, my American brain, I hear Asia and I think of like China.
Yeah,
Um and
instead of
while
like Kazakhstan and like the Middle East and
yes.
stuff. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Where it's like yes, definitely in China there were horsemen, but this is kind of talking more about it's harkening back to where we were talking about the origin of the modern horse and the Scythians and whatnot. In those early horse civilizations, were kind of in the Middle East area. It's still counted as Asia, but it's closer to Europe than we
Yeah.
think of when we're thinking of like East Asia.
Eurasia, if you will.
Yes. Now these early hoof coverings generally were hoof wrappings, and they were usually made out of things like rawhide, leather, or even dried grass. Now, the earliest written record of hoof coverings being used is from Herodotus. Call back to him.
Of course. Our main man.
Yep. And he was describing the Scythians in the 5th century BCE. And he was describing how the Scythians wrapped their horses' hooves in felt.
Which is that's an interesting material choice.
It
Like
is, right?
Oh, especially for the Scythians who like nomadic, a lot of hunting, a lot of leather. You think that they would have gone for the rawhide or something like that. But felt is interesting. I wonder what type of felt it was. Like whether it was from like the regions like goats or sheep or whatever. Like I did felting when I was in grade 11, I think it was. And I made a felt wool hat and I felted all the material myself. It was miserable. I hated every moment of it. And I also was making a beret, and I overworked my felt too much so that it was really thin in one spot on the top of it, and it was perfect everywhere else except for the back. There was a really thick part at the back and a really thin part on the top, and the rest of it was kind of okay. Needless to say, I was not the best in textiles at school. I was pretty good, but it's not great. Felting was not my strong spot. I can say
I
that
like
for sure.
needle felting, where you just stab the felt.
Yeah.
Stab the wool a whole bunch with a little needle. I've seen some like crazy art pieces that people have done with it, and I'm like, maybe I could do that, and then I just don't bother though, because it takes a while. I don't, also I take everything Herodotus writes with a little bit of a grain of salt.
Yes, as should everyone who pays attention to all the things that Herodotus says.
So like it could have been felt. It could have also been leather. Like I don't know. Like
Yeah, yeah. Could have been felt, but he also just might have been blind. We don't know.
So later on in 4th century BCE, a Chinese medical text called Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine. Oh my god, I can't speak.
You nearly said it the UK way.
How was the UK way?
Medicine.
Medicine?
Yeah.
Huh.
A lot
I
of
guess I've
people in the
never
UK
heard
say
them
medicine.
say that. Huh.
A lot of people in Australia say medicine, which is really
Oh.
funny. Yeah, certain medicines or yeah, they do it.
I like that. It's funny. Later on in the 4th century BCE, a Chinese medical text called the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine describes covering horse hooves in cloth or leather. An interesting thing about this book is that, the title doesn't include horses in it at all. This is just a book for internal medicine. They just also have a whole section on horses and like horse care and horse medical care, which I thought was interesting.
That is, especially in a book like that.
I think, I mean, that's another thing, another interesting thing I learned from like equine massage therapy is that like Chinese medicine often, even in ancient times, like covered both humans and horses. Like horses were some of the earliest patients of like Chinese medicine, which is pretty interesting.
That is, yeah. Because I think it's really, I think not a lot of people, when you mention like China or like a lot of East Asian cultures and whatnot, people's brains don't immediately go to, oh yeah, a horse culture, which is really interesting because they were everywhere. Like
Yeah.
everyone used horses. Like,
And just like Chinese culture is extremely diverse
yeah,
and
there are
it's something,
so many different regions and so many
yeah.
different places. Like,
And that's just something that like, again, like as an American, I raise my hand that we just like don't learn very much about it. We kind of see it as a monolith,
mm,
uh, which is unfortunate. But yeah,
yeah.
definitely we don't think of it as like, oh yeah, horses, like a horse culture. Even though, yes, horses were there, especially by the 4th century BCE. Also included in the text, as well as just like basic horse medical care, is also just horse hoof care. So they were definitely trimming horses' hooves at that
Mm.
point, and also like covering them in oils or different like fatty like concoctions.
Substances.
Yes, yeah. They were taking care of their horses' hooves back then.
I suppose it's like one of those things as well where it's like it's an expensive animal to keep. You really want it to be at the top of its game most of the time, if not
Mm-hmm.
all of the time. And if it's not, it's going to affect not just you, but your family and the things that you use to do with it, you know?
Mm-hmm. Especially if you have like a military horse.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Now, in addition to wrapping hooves in cloth and leather, there was also grass. A grass horseshoe was found by archaeologists at Mawangdui tombs in Changsha, Hunan province, dating back to the 2nd century BCE. Leather horseshoes or horse boots were found by archaeologists in Turpan, China, dating to 400 BCE. So we're kind of seeing this progression that they didn't have like those metal horseshoes or nail-on horseshoes by any any stretch of the imagination, but they were covering their horses' hooves and they were slowly trying to move up from just having their hooves be wrapped to actually making like boots to put on their horses. And this is where the umugatsu of Japan comes in.
So this is my fault because I feel like this episode was a little bit inspired by the fact that I started playing Assassin's Creed Shadows recently, and if you have played Assassin's Creed Shadows, the horse that you get at the start of the game, his name is Kiri, and it is the family horse, and Kiri is wearing straw sandals, which I was beside myself. I had never seen anything like it. I had never seen anything that like the cross hatching that went over the top of the hoof and like the base of it as well. I'd never seen anything like it, and I immediately took a screenshot and sent it to Keegan and was like, "What is this? What is this?" And then I started googling. And came back 5 minutes later to be like, "Oh my God, there were straw horse sandals. Like they were little shoes that they had for them." And I was beside myself. I'm very disappointed to say that Kiri is the only horse in Assassin's Creed Shadows that has these shoes.
Oh,
But I
really?
suppose, yeah, which I was kind of disappointed by because you have the ability to swap out your saddles. And I really would have assumed that they would have just attached them to the saddles. But no, Kiri is the only one that has them, which is kind of sad and disappointing to me. But I suppose if you really wanted to make up a reason as to why, it could just be that Kiri was a very well taken care of family horse that had been living with them forever. So, he might have received a bit more diligent care or something. But it doesn't really make sense to me when you also have Yasuke, who is an exceptionally well-renowned samurai who were very like who took very good care of their horses. And had very, very nice like armor and tack and barding and whatnot for them. Uh, so it was a little bit disappointing. But in saying that, I can't really complain because I did learn about these from this game. And they are really cool. And I thought it was kind of awesome.
I wonder if they just didn't feel like adding the umugatsu like to the because it must be part of that horse's like
Model.
model. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm
So did
almost
they just
certain it
like not
is.
feel like adding it to the models of the other
Which
horses?
is
Like,
which is really weird to me because being able to swap out the saddles, all the horses have the same model. So being able to swap out the saddles makes me think that you could have just attached the umugatsu to the saddles, and whenever you swap out the saddles, it adds them on or takes them off.
yeah, I don't know.
But at the same time, I'm not a 3D modeler. I'm not an animating rigger. I don't know how this stuff works. I don't know how difficult it would be to do something like that. And I don't want to make, accusations to be like, oh, they were just lazy and didn't want to do it, as opposed to like, that would have been really difficult to do. In saying that, though, I do think that they should have spattered them around and made, because like, even the horses that you find out in the wild, or like, I say in the wild, they're domesticated horses that people are riding, but the horses that you find other NPCs riding don't have tack, don't have shoes, and like have basically just like a head collar and a bridle on them. Like it's not even a proper bridle, it's just like it literally just looks like a head collar with a set of reins attached to it. Um because there's no bit on it properly either, and they've just used the same horse for every single NPC, which is just this base bay horse that you find absolutely everywhere. Um and like that's not the worst. I mean, I am being really picky complaining about it. But yeah, like it's just one of those things where it's like every video game. You wish for more. You don't get it, but you wish for more. You wish that they just, talk to a few people who knew what they were doing, or, maybe if they had like an advisor or someone talking to them about it. Because the other problem with the horses in the game is that a lot of the coats are really inaccurate to what would have been around at the time, and a lot of them don't make any sense. And to be fair, I will give them a pass on this because they also have mythical beasts in the game that you can ride around on. Um, they have the one scaled horse with the wings on its head and the catfish antenna, which is really funny. I can't remember what its name is, but so
Is that different from the Keelan?
yeah, yeah. I think so. Because my sister thought it was one of those two, but I don't think it is. It's got a different name. Hang on, let me look for it.
Well,
Let me
the wing
see.
thing doesn't sound familiar, but the scaled
Yeah,
horse
it's
does.
called the Namazu horse. And I've never done any research into what that might be or what that lore or like mythology might be. This is what it looks
Well,
like.
the Namazu is a giant mythical catfish. So I
Yeah,
wonder if this is just a horse that is like themed after the
I can
catfish.
almost guarantee you that's basically just what they've done. And they were like, you know what, this will be funny. Let's just do that. And
And that
fair
makes
enough.
sense cuz
Yeah,
I think Keelan is the Chinese version and then like Kirin is the
yeah,
Japanese
yeah.
version of the like unicorn-esque animal that
And
is
there
different.
is a similar one to the Kieran. It's not quite right, but it's very close. They've obviously it's from a set called the Hatu set, which is obviously water and aqua, and like the whole
Yeah.
color palette is like teals and aquas and like bright blues, to match the creature. But yeah, there's also like a Quailan mount too, which is like not quite a Quailan, but it's like very similar to it.
Oh,
Yeah, you can get a bunch of really cool
that
little
almost looks
mythical
like
beasties.
a celestial lion or something. That's cool.
Yeah. But yeah, like it's one of those things where you wish that it was done a little bit better, but I can understand why it wasn't. The game is far and wide an action up like an action adventure game, not so much an RPG. As much as I want it to be an RPG, and as much as it has RPG elements, it really is an action adventure game. It's not meant to
Hmm.
be making you feel things and sob and cry, despite the fact that I did do that. But
Yeah. And at the end of the day, it's like, us horse people, we can bitch and moan about these games, but like they're not made for us. they're, like the purpose of the game is not to be a horse game. It's to be, like you said, an action adventure game.
the horses are just a nice addition, and finding the umugatsu on Kiri was a really cool surprise. I will explain, like I will absolutely admit to. I was super super excited about it. Like I was over the it was such a cool little thing. Like it didn't mean anything, didn't affect the gameplay at all. I was just like, "Oh my God, that's so cool." And I just
Yeah.
immediately wanted to show people.
I know. And then you like immediately sent it to me and I was like, "Oh my god, that's so cool."
Yeah, yeah.
So, for those of you that don't know what we've been talking about for like, I don't know, the past 20 minutes, an umugatsu is an ancient straw, basically horse sandal. To try and kind of like explain what they look like, imagine like a disc of like dried grass or straw that's like woven, and that goes on like on the underside of the horse's hoof, and then more woven straw that kind of creates straps that hold the sandal on the horse's hoof. Now you might be wondering, like, straw, how is that going to do anything on a horse's hoof? So the purpose was less to provide protection for a horse's hoof, and it was more to provide traction over smooth surfaces and also to muffle the sound of hoof falls. So it was actually used a lot by people in the military in order to actually hide the sound of their hooves. Now, this continued to be used by soldiers and just the average person well past the introduction of the nailed on horseshoe to Japan. So it could be used on top of horseshoes, it could be used in correspondence with them. And as you can probably imagine, I mean, they're made out of straw or grass. They are inexpensive and they also would break really easily. They're intended to be disposable, so they're really easy and cheap to replace.
Which makes sense because, if you're for their intended purpose, yeah, you would want to make sure that they are just, not, yeah. Easy to replace is like, sums it all up. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
listen, they're made out of a cheap material. They can probably be made pretty quickly. They're, not intended to last forever. They're just there to do their job, and then you take them off and then you move on.
Yeah, definitely. And they weren't like used all the time. Like if you had your horse just like turned out or something, you didn't put these on your horse's hooves. You just used them when you're like going from A to B and you knew there was going to be some slippery parts, then you could use the umugatsu. Moving on to our next not horseshoe, not horseshoe, or at least a hoof covering from the past. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention the Roman hipposandal, because this kind of popped up everywhere when I tried to look up the history of the horseshoe. And is kind of funny to me because people seem kind of like obsessed with the hipposandal, and it seems like it wasn't all that like widespread or popular. Like, just in the grand scheme of things. So, one thing is that the Romans kind of often incorrectly get credited with inventing the horseshoe. And often what they're really talking about is the hipposandal. And the interesting thing is that we like don't really know if even the hipposandal was used that widely by the Romans or if it was just used by Romans in one part of their empire. One thing that kind of leads us to think that maybe they didn't have them all that widespread or didn't use them until very late in the like empire's life is that Xenophon never mentioned horseshoes in his writings, and while he's Greek, not Roman, the Romans definitely took a lot from the Greeks as far
Yeah.
as like knowledge and culture and that sort of thing. And the Romans weren't necessarily much of a horse culture. I mean, they definitely utilized horses a lot, but that wasn't their like strong suit really. It's not what they're like known for is like being a horse culture. And so it's very likely that they pretty much took everything they know about horses from like the Greeks to start out with.
Which is like, what didn't they do that for?
Yes, yeah.
Their deity system, the horses, you name it, they borrowed it.
Yeah, pretty much. And then like as they expanded, their empire, then they started adopting, whatever horse practices came from that region. Another thing that kind of points towards Romans not really having horseshoes at all is that there is no Roman art or statues that portray horses with horseshoes on. And some people argue, well, yeah, it's art or they're statues, so they're not going to be 100% accurate or detailed enough. But at the same time, I kind of think like if you bothered to include all the other details of like a horse in your statue, why not also include horseshoes? They're not that difficult to
Yeah.
add on.
It's also really shocking to me that Xenophon never mentioned them because he kind of mentioned everything.
Exactly, that's the other thing. Like he was the horse dude at the time.
Yeah. So he either didn't agree with them, didn't like them, or had some. I bet you that's it. I bet you he's like, no, I think they're dumb. So I'm not gonna write about
It's
them.
some of the evidence pointing towards the fact that horseshoes didn't exist back then. At that point, not iron on or nail on horseshoes like we think of, and not hipposandals.
Yeah, yeah.
He mentioned wrapping hooves to protect them, like, and those would be thought of as more like the way we put bell boots
Yeah.
on a horse's hooves nowadays. So things to protect their hooves when they're like either stabled or in their paddock. And then also, I think he mentioned some like coverings for warfare, and that's more of for protection. Like kind of like armor.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so yeah, they're not. But the fact that he doesn't mention horseshoes and he's like such a horse dude is that like they probably didn't exist yet. And so I mean, Xenophon, he wasn't a Roman, but again, Romans pretty much borrowed everything from him. And so if Xenophon's not talking about it, probably the Romans probably didn't have it either. And so it's believed that the hipposandal developed in modern day Great Britain by the Romans there, and that they used them in the 2nd century AD. And I thought that was interesting because, in my like preliminary research, it was just saying the Romans. And if you just say like I mean the Romans had such a large empire and they were around for such a long time. If you just say the Romans, it makes it sound like all of them had hipposandals. But then, when I started digging deeper into it, they're like, "Oh yeah, no, the Romans in Great Britain, like them specifically, they used hipposandals. So it wasn't even all that widespread, like throughout their
Yeah.
empire."
Now I'm like, shit, should I go back onto Assassin's Creed Valhalla and see if there's like
That would be
there's
interesting, yeah.
because like one of the things you can do in Assassin's Creed Valhalla is because you're in like 8th, 9th century England, like you can go around and pick up old Roman artifacts and keep them in your place. And like one of the things is like one of the activities in the game is finding these Roman artifacts and bringing them back to a guy who studies them. And I'm
That'd
like,
be interesting.
I wonder. That makes me think.
If there's a hippo sandal, that'd be really cool.
That would be really cool.
So when I'm talking about a hippo sandal, what they tended to look like is that they were a thick metal plate on the bottom. So we were finally introducing metal. However, they weren't nailed on, they were secured with leather laces. So they're much more similar to kind of the modern hoof boot, but even then, not really.
Mm.
And they were kind of meant, again, to give traction rather than as much protection. And they had like grooves on the bottom of them. And interestingly enough, a TV show tried to make a recreation of a hippo sandal and then tried it on a horse. And they found that they did not really like them, that they were like pretty clunky.
Yeah.
and and didn't stay on all that well. And that really kind of makes me wonder, like, was the design itself a poor design, or did they just recreate it poorly? Well, moving on to the actual nail-on horseshoe, its origins are highly disputed, and it's kind of a mystery where the first horseshoe came from.
Wow. Drama in the horse world? No.
No.
Tell me it isn't so. There's no way.
Well, if you're not familiar with horseshoes in general, what I'm talking about with a nail on horseshoe is that they're a piece of metal, and they're kind of in a, I mean, it's hard to explain it as, like, because we just say horseshoe shaped. Like, it's
Yeah,
just
it's
become
yeah,
so
the amount of
ingrained in
things
culture.
yeah, the amount of things that have been described as a horseshoe shape, it's like, well, it's
Yeah.
like a U shape, basically.
Yeah.
It's
Yes.
probably the
Yeah.
easiest way of saying it.
Yeah. It's a U shaped strip of metal, and then using nails, they actually nail it into the bottom of the horse's hoof. And since they're nailing it into the hoof wall that's just made of keratin, the horse doesn't feel it, doesn't hurt them.
Yeah, the first question on every single YouTube short I've ever seen of a horse getting hot shoed is, does that hurt the horse? And it's like, do you think the horse would be standing still, nibbling on their hair if they were hurt? Like, I
Yeah.
know that it's just people who have never grown up in this world and like are just being curious, but wow, I don't know. I feel like it would be pretty obvious if it hurt the horse. But
Yeah.
yes, it does not hurt the horse. It can hurt the horse if done incorrectly,
Yeah.
but no, it doesn't hurt the horse.
Yeah. If done correctly, it doesn't hurt them. And if their, hooves are all healthy and as they should be. But yeah, so that is specifically what I'm talking about when I talk about a nail on horseshoe. So there's quite a few reasons why this is a mystery and why we don't know for sure. Because you kind of think, like, okay, well, why don't you just, like, aren't there archaeological digs? Like, why don't you just go dig for some horseshoes, and then when you find one, like, that's the, the earliest one you find is the earliest horseshoe. The problem is that metals like iron were really valuable in the past. And so it's unlikely that old shoes were just discarded like they were later on. They were likely recycled, like melted down and recycled into something else. So even if horseshoes were being used back then, they might not have been buried with horses. They would have been taken off of the horses' bodies if they died. And they wouldn't have just discarded old shoes when they replaced the shoes. They would have, like, re-smelted them.
Which makes a lot of sense. A lot of things were resmelted and reused.
Yes, yeah. It's also hard to date shoes in archaeological digs just because of, like, the nature of them. Because there's always the probability that that shoe is actually much more modern, and that, like, let's think about a bunch of Roman dig sites. There's centuries of civilization that has gone on in those areas after the fact, where there have been horses with horseshoes on that could have thrown a shoe accidentally or something happened, and that shoe could have ended up basically looking like it's from the time period that they dug it up, but it's not. So that makes it a little bit tricky to date them.
Mm.
And so what is believed to be the earliest horseshoe was a bronze horseshoe that was found in an Etruscan tomb, and it's thought to be from around 400 BCE.
Around the same time that on the other side of the world we were doing like straw shoes and grass shoes
Mm-hmm.
and
Yes.
leather ones, which is interesting because it's like, hmm,
Yeah, it is generally thought, and that this is something that kind of surprised me, is that horseshoes, they got at least popular in Europe first and then moved to
yeah,
Asia.
which doesn't really shock me because like I feel like in a lot of Asian countries and a lot of East Asian countries and whatnot, like there's always going to be more like instinct to go with something that's easy to find the material for. Like way
Mm.
easier to find the material for. Like, let's be real, if terracotta could have been made into horseshoes, probably would have been. Like, there was a lot of it
Yeah, good
around.
point.
Yeah, like if there was whatever is abundant in the area is going to be used, and bronze, you know, was not. Like it was for certain things, but it was like it was for statues and royalty and things like that.
Now, written references to horseshoes in text start to pop up around 400 AD. The earliest clear reference to nail on horseshoes is from 910 AD. And then the earliest horseshoe that had nails still in it was found in a 5th century tomb of King Childeric I in Belgium. So by 1000 AD, cast bronze horseshoes were common in Europe.
I do wonder why it was bronze that they chose for it. Whether it was just because it was really easy to get, like to come across, because it was lighter than iron, because it was, like what the deciding factor went into, because it was cheap enough, but like,
Yeah, I don't know.
because bronze is such like an interesting, like you wouldn't really expect to see it, especially when like,
Yeah, I'm not sure why. And then at some point they seemed to transition to iron, and then they like did not go back because
yeah.
iron is like the traditional horseshoe.
Mm-hmm.
Another interesting thing about like those very early horseshoes, they had they had scalloped outer rims. And it's kind of like hard for me to picture what they're saying, but basically I guess it was to try and like improve like traction and stuff so they didn't slip around.
Yeah, I can only think of it as being like they probably would have just like pressed a like a die into it that created like the bump, like the scalped pattern,
Yeah.
and maybe it was just there to provide traction and make sure that it wasn't slippery. Or I do wonder
Yeah.
whether it's because it made them use less as well, but I suppose if it was just impressed on it, then that wouldn't really affect anything.
Yeah, no, they were just like doing that thing where they like pound it
Yeah.
a little bit so that it makes it a little scalloped. Yeah, I
Hmm.
don't know. I mean, clearly it wasn't like that popular because it went out of fashion. Like it just kind of stopped. Now, by the 13th to 14th centuries, horseshoes were being widely manufactured. And at this point, they were ready made horseshoes that then a farrier could bring with him, and then he could size it or change it just a little bit to meet the horse's needs.
Which is funny because like they thinking about that is like you would have had to bring your horse to the farrier
Yes.
because they didn't have portable forges. Like they didn't have a
Right.
way unless you were like living in a castle and like had a forge near you or something
Right.
like
Yeah.
that. There was
Had your
no
own
way.
personal forge.
Yeah, you'd have to bring your horse to the farrier.
Yeah. I mean, even in Black Beauty, when I was reading it, like they had to bring the horses to the farrier.
Mm.
They
It's
didn't.
not
The
it's it's
farrier
not
didn't
as
come
cushy
out.
these days where you can just call them up and be like, "Hey, can you come out in next
Yep.
week?"
Yeah. So in the 16th century, hot shoeing became popular. And that is where they, heat it up. They mold it to be the shape of the horse's hoof, like custom for, each horse's hoof. And then they actually will, like, check and test the size of it by, like, holding it up to the horse's hoof. So, and then it's so hot that it actually kind of like burns a little bit into the sole and the hoof wall, but because it's thick enough, it doesn't hurt the horse or anything.
Yeah, that's another instance of people saying, "Does this hurt the horse?" And it's like, "No, it's just it smells bad. It's not a nice smell."
Yeah, I smelled
Um,
it the other day at the barn. It smells like at the dentist, when they like
yeah.
when the
Or
drills,
like
the smell the drills make when
yeah, or
yeah.
like burning hair, or if you've ever
Yeah.
smelt like burning hair, it's a really great. And obviously like it's the same protein, it's keratin, so it's going to smell like that, but yeah, there's just like a certain smell to it that's like, "Oh, yeah, that's not nice.
Yeah, it's not a pleasant
That's
smell.
yeah, that's nasty."
It's cool in that, it's like custom fit. It's like, getting custom shoes on your feet that are fitted for them.
Mm.
Now, they think that horseshoes started to make their way over to China in around like 400 AD. So the remnants of iron horseshoes have been found in northeast China tomb dating to 414 AD. And then the earliest written reference in China to horseshoes dates back to 938 AD. And so they were there, not too long after horseshoes got introduced in Europe, but they did not become popular. They didn't become popular until probably around the 13th century. And so iron horseshoes became more common in northern China in 1271 AD. Sorry, my brain is. I'm
We're
getting a
getting
little
there.
tired. Yeah, I'm getting a little tired.
We're getting there.
And so that's the past. And nowadays, there are many types of horse hoof protection, and it seems like they just keep on coming out with more and more ideas,
Yeah, for sure.
which is kind of cool. I mean, the because science is really starting to take a look at the horse's hoof and realize just how important a horse's feet are to the functioning of the rest of their bodies.
I think there's more like wider acceptance about the fact as well that like a metal shoe is very inflexible and
Mm-hmm.
like for horses that need the therapeutic support, like sometimes, if they have issues with the bulb of the foot or anything like that and they need to be able to like move or take pressure off one side or the other or whatnot. It's like it's not like a cow where you can just put a block on one side and let them take the pressure off it. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's always going to have pressure on it. They're always going to be walking on it. Like they need that foot. Hence the reason horses cannot live on a prosthesis. But like I think it's really cool to see more things like more flexible materials, more materials that let the horse's foot move the way that it always like the way that it naturally would, even if it does have protection on the bottom of it. That and things like using blocks to adjust the gait of the horse or like a correct like a wonky leg or like a funny limp that they might have, or if a foal has some issues or whatnot, they can use therapeutic shoeing or blocks and whatnot to sort of adjust how they walk on it, putting a bit more height at the back to support the front or vice versa, and things like that, which is like really wild. Like there are some crazy things that they can do.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and also like on top of that, there's a bunch of crazy things that they can do, like glue on shoes or pads and things like that, that are not really that expensive, which means that when you have, rural areas or countries that have, like lower GDPs and stuff, and, like they can't, a lot of these people can't afford to be looking, a full set of shoes every 6 to 8 weeks or whatever, your horse
Mm-hmm.
needs. It's like it's a band, it might be a band-aid on a bullet wound situation, but at least the horse is, getting some sort of support. My sister showed me, she's like, she loves watching videos from this guy who does a lot of therapeutic free shoeing in Mexico for people who just like can't afford it otherwise. And they have horses with club feet or things like that, and they get them adjusted, and sorted out so that it's it's not a cure all, but it's definitely more comfortable, and it's definitely like a start of getting them fixed as well. And like club feet are so common these days.
I mean, if you looked up just like the different shapes of just nail on metal shoes, it's insane.
Yeah, things like egg bars and
Yeah.
and and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
And the main purpose of that of these, different shapes is all to, I mean, often they're therapeutic in some like aspect. If they're, like some of them were trying to get them to shift weight, from one side to the other. Others are to try and kind of lift the heel up maybe, or, different therapeutic purposes. So that's why if you might see horseshoes that don't look like they're that in that classic U shape, and if you're
Mm.
like seeing that and you're like what, and wondering why, like that's usually the reason. The purpose is that different shapes, they distribute weight differently.
Yeah.
Essentially, that's like the primary purpose.
And every horse is going to be an individual case. Some will do
Yes,
better
yeah.
barefoot, some will do better. Some can be weaned off their shoes and made to be barefoot. Some will just never get there, and will struggle without their shoes. And that's kind of just how it is.
Yep.
I think if it wasn't, case by case, you'd go back to sort of the situations that you used to have, where it's just like every horse gets a shoe and none of them know how to walk on their own feet anymore. Like,
Mm-hmm. There's also composite and glue-on shoes that you were kind of alluding to earlier. That they stay on for, like a couple weeks, a certain amount of
mm,
time. And the reason people often like them is that they're a little bit more flexible. So, a horse's hoof, they flex and they move. And, the metal does not have that flexibility. And so you can have these composites or glue-ons. And then there's also hoof boots that some people use for hoof protection. And they are more short term in that like often people put them on for a ride and then take it off when they turn their horse out, or stable them or whatever. Um,
yeah. One of the great
because if you
examples I
just
have.
left it on, it would just fall off, I think. Like
Yeah.
no matter how good and like how good a hoof boot is, I think if you just left it on in the pasture all day long and all night and stuff, that horse would find a way to get it off of their foot.
Yeah. 100%. If they can figure out how to get a fly mask off or how to get a gate open, they can absolutely figure out how to get a foot bit off.
I've ridden a lot of horses that have worn hoof boots of some sort because it's pretty popular in like the endurance and trail riding world.
Oh yeah, I can only imagine. My question to you is, I've never ridden a horse in boots, in hoof boots, but
Mm-hmm.
my question to you is, does it feel any different? Can you tell that the gait is different, or not really?
I can't really tell. No.
Yeah, that's fair. I didn't think so, but I was like,
I
maybe.
mean, I feel like it would be noticeable if like the horse was like tripping more than usual or something. And I one horse that I rode who he the first day he had his like normal shoes on, but he was still kind of ouchy on the rocks
Hmm.
and wasn't loving them. So we put boots on over. And the next day, what I did feel the difference was that he was not as ouchy and he was like going over the rocks confidently.
Let's go.
So yeah, so that was nice. I mean, so I did feel a difference then, but that was like a positive difference.
Yeah.
I think that concludes our horseshoe
Our
episode.
horseshoe episode.
It's not 2 a.m. I don't know what to do with myself.
Crazy. It's also like, right, it's refreshing to do an episode that doesn't go for like an hour, but those ones are the ones where it's like I love both because like if it goes for longer, it means I'm so engrossed and I'm yapping to a
Yes,
point
yeah.
where like I can't stop.
Yeah.
But I'm also just like, oh yeah, it's probably good for Keegan to not go to bed before like 4 in the morning.
Yeah. Though, okay, that's the thing is that some of the like upcoming topics, most of them are probably going to be pretty involved. Is all I was saying.
Thank you for listening to History from Horseback. We hope that you enjoyed this episode, and we are on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, so give us a follow for more historical horse content. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you out on the trail.
Dude, I was so happy when I saw him again.
Oh,
I was just like, he just made me smile. And the fact that like, so I went over to look at the little baby foals because there's 3 of them now.
oh no.
And so I was over there and then I was talking to them and it's like pretty far away, but I like look up and I can see Ace at the paddock in the distance and he's just right there at the gate and he's staring at me. And I was like,
He's like, come over here right now. I have something to tell you.
yeah, he was like, how dare you be here and not with me?
Are you playing with babies instead of me? I'm the baby.
Yeah,
Play with me.
exactly.